Seto is Professor of Geography and Urbanization Science at Yale University, School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, or Environmental Science, I guess, where she also serves as Associate Dean of Research and Director of Doctoral Studies. Dr. Seto's research focuses on the human transformation of land and links between urbanization, global change, globalization, and sustainability. In this past year alone, 2015, Dr. Seto's had publications in Science, Ambio, PNAS, and the Journal of Environmental Management. So she's a very productive publisher. And in particular, she's been producing a lot of research on China and India and their sort of massively ongoing processes of urbanization. And she was also coordinating lead author for IPCC, the 5th assessment report in 2007, and serves on an amazing number of important national and international committees on all sorts of things: land use change, urbanization, environmental change in general. And so she has a very particular and broad view on these sustainability issues. Dr. Seto.
Well, because I am batting starting at the 7th inning, I'm going to just give you my punchline first. And I really have two main take-home messages. And one really follows from Bill Clark's presentation about sustainability science and kind of the genesis of sustainability science, and basically making the argument that we are at a point where we urgently need an urbanization science, moving away from urban studies and smorgasbord of studies around cities that don't add up to a science that is actionable, that is solutions oriented. So that's the first take-home message, that we need this sustainability, urbanization science, and that the basis of this emerging urbanization science, actually a lot of that comes from the sustainability science literature and what has been learned from 2-3 decades of sustainability science. So that's one take-home message. The second take-home message is the urgency with which we need to develop this and apply it. And again, this is, I should have taken some of Bill's slides. This interface between science and the theory of cities is quite disconnected from the day-to-day practice of managing cities. And in fact, before this seminar, we had a lunch, and there was discussion about infrastructure, about the practicality of funding infrastructure and managing infrastructure. And I was sitting there thinking, that's in the practice of managing cities. But if you actually go to the literature on urban studies, you're not going to find a lot about that. It's very, very different. And so we urgently need this intersection of the science with the practice in cities and in the study of urbanization. I want to start off with just a few statistics to make the argument that the sustainability of the planet depends very much on what happens in cities now and going forward. So I imagine everybody in this room has heard the statistic many times now that we now are living in a planet where more than 50% of the population lives in urban areas. How many people have heard that statistic? Has anyone not heard that statistic? No one. Okay, so if we normalize that represent in a different way, we see that the global urban population is growing very rapidly on a weekly basis. There's a lot of discussion in the literature, a lot of debate about whether cities are part of the problem or part of the solution. It's very clear that regardless of whether you believe that they are part of the problem or part of the solution, that they're critical to the economic enterprise of this planet. Bill Muma was saying, well, it's going to be interesting what happens in Paris. And in fact, today, I was supposed to be in Paris, and I said, I can't go to Paris, I'm going to Boston. Because cities are meeting today to sign an agreement led by Mike Bloomberg, And they're basically saying we're going to do something about climate change, forget about nation states. I found this statistic, or I find this statistic pretty amazing, that if cities were to do something collectively, they really could change the needle completely. But they have to collectively do something. And here is my third main take-home message, which is that there's a lot that's being done at the local level which is not scientifically based. A lot that's being done at the local level that's taking a lot of human capital, financial capital, infrastructure, and it has a lot of other benefits like community building, and some efforts have some poverty reduction in some pockets. But in terms of aggregating to at a global level to making some bigger changes, many of the efforts that are being undertaken at the local level are not making a difference. And I've been going around the world making this argument. A lot of this is based on the work in the IPCC chapter that I co-led. And city mayors are very upset when I make this comment that, you know, the efforts that are being undertaken don't aggregate to making a big change. I can talk offline about, you know, what is being done, but it highlights that a lot of the efforts, the sustainability efforts at the local level, are not science-based, and really leads to this need for an urbanization science that is science-based. So these statistics that many of you probably have seen, that we're going to add somewhere around 3 billion more people in urban areas over the next 35 years. Places like this is in Shanghai in 1978, and in 2015. Can we do that again? Sure, sure. And you know, this is 1978, and this is 2015 or 13. And you know, my apologies to the remote sensors in the room, because I would have had lots of images of, you know, cities just exploding around the world. But you know, if you look at satellite images and look at cities around the world, you're seeing this from 35,000 feet. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of debate in the literature about whether cities represent a crisis or an opportunity for sustainability. Certainly there's a lot in the environmental literature that argues that cities are a crisis for sustainability, whether it's emissions or Jack's pandas and loss of habitat, or modification of hydrology or biogeochemistry. But interestingly, if you go to a lot of the social science literature, you get a very different story, that cities are hubs of innovation, right? 80% of the global GDP is generated in urban areas. We see that around the world, countries where the majority of the population live in urban areas, we see a strong correlation between that and high levels of economic growth and GDP per capita. So many countries are trying to increase urbanization as a way to reduce poverty and to jumpstart development. It's also very clear that cities are places where there is more delivery of sanitation, clean water, opportunities for women, education, etc. So whether or not cities are going to be part of the solution or part of the problem partly depends on the disciplinary lens. But here I would argue that we actually need to go to the problem, as Bill and Bill were saying, go to the problem and then try to identify the types of tools that we need, rather than starting with the disciplinary lens of demography or economics and ignoring the complexity of cities. So one of the things that I think is particularly interesting in terms of moving this urbanization science forward is the lack of theory and the lack of theoretical literature that really can move us forward. So one of the questions that I've been asking for a while now is, are we in a fundamentally different era of urbanization today, and today broadly defined, than in the past. And if we are in a different era, depending on how we measure it and what metrics we're looking at, what do the theories tell us? I'm curious. Is anyone in here an urban studies major, urban geography, urban economics? So nobody knows who these people are in the room? Okay, so if I was talking to a bunch of urbanists, people would say, we've got, geographers would know von Thunen, economists would know Mills and Isard, sociologists would know Burgess, all urbanists would know Jane Jacobs. There's a lot in the literature from many different fields, be it geography, economics, about cities. And we can reach into a very long literature to draw on theories and studies on why cities grow, what makes cities rich, why do people move into cities, the push-pull theory about migration, etc. But what's interesting is we don't have a single theory to explain why and how it can be that two cities in one country have a greater population than an entire country, and what the resource demands of those two cities are relative to this country, and what it means for well-being and livelihoods in these cities. We don't have a single theory to explain that or to help us understand what will happen in the future as cities get bigger. So I would argue that we need a lot of new science paradigms. We can build on the canons, but we have to ask how applicable are the canons and the theories that we're studying. We know that global systems are increasingly connected to cities, simply from some of the statistics that I've shown earlier, but we don't understand these two very basic questions. How do we conceptualize and characterize these linkages between the process of urbanization and global sustainability? And here I really emphasize urbanization as a process as opposed to cities as places. And here's where the link between urbanization science and sustainability science really comes together, is what knowledge do we need in order to help urban areas become really meaningful catalysts for sustainability solutions? What knowledge do they need? How can they get there? And here I think one of the big challenges is that it's like, I've been working in China and India for a couple of decades now, and I think designing sustainable cities in places that are changing so quickly, it's like designing a plane that's already taken off. And we can't afford to find the best solution or the optimal solution. So those of you who are economists in the room, there may not be a Pareto optimal. But I think that what we need to think about is how do we avoid the worst case scenario, especially given that there's so many cities developing simultaneously around the world. This is actually one of the early diagrams from the work of the IPCC chapter on urban mitigation from Working Group 3, where the team of lead authors, we were sitting around for many days trying to understand what the different components of cities and urbanization and urban emissions were. And one of the things I found particularly interesting after many days of conversations was that we know a lot about these three things: transport in cities, buildings, and despite the pre-seminar lunch conversation, we know a lot about infrastructure. But what we don't know are all of these arrows and the linkages. Because transport, buildings, and infrastructure take place in places. But it's these linkages to places that are not urban or to other cities that are critical for sustainability. And we're not measuring those, or we have very few ways of measuring them. And I would argue this is probably one of the biggest challenges for urbanization science moving forward, is not to further study what's happening within cities, but rather to study the linkages between cities and the process of urbanization with the planetary system. There is a growing, I would say, consensus, but there's not a consensus yet, that cities in and of themselves are not sustainable. I mean, Bill Reese wrote about this 20 years ago. But that we can make the process more sustainable. And that requires a fundamental change in the way in which we study urbanization as a process. So we need to just spend a lot more time trying to understand these linkages, these back arrows. And this is where the link with sustainability science comes in, this urgent need for new frameworks. Do our models and theories reflect and capture the processes that we aim to study? Believe it or not, this is still the dominant perspective on cities and urbanization in the literature, whether it's urban ecology or urban economics. The theoretical framing we have about cities is it's this place and there are these other places, it's these hinterlands or rural areas, and even if you're thinking about urban to rural linkages or a continuum, we still think of cities and urbanization as a place. And if we really want to move towards an urbanization science, we need to move from this paradigm to a new paradigm and research agenda where we're looking at these global linkages and linkages between urban places and not just within a single city. I want to just highlight two results from the IPCC chapter just to make the argument for the urgency for why we need this science. One of the key results from the chapter is that cities contribute to more than 70% of global CO2 emissions. But interestingly enough, there's a lot of variation between cities and between different types of cities. And this is where the science has to come in. We're not going to solve the urban sustainability challenge studying one city at a time or solving the problem one city at a time. We actually need to radically increase the number of observations, the ends that we're actually studying. So what you see here on the left is for Annex 1 country cities, on average, so these are in blue are cities where the per capita energy use is below the national average. And in yellow, it's supposed to be yellow, but in yellow it's average per capita energy use is above the national average. So another way to think about this is cities that are in blue are more efficient in terms of energy use than the national average, and cities in yellow are less efficient. And Annex 1 countries, these are primarily OECD developed country cities, and non-Annex 1 countries are primarily the developing country cities. So why do we see these differences? Well, there are a number of different reasons. One is the economic structure. The economic base is very different. These are primarily service cities, service economy cities, so they're exporting their emissions elsewhere because they're not manufacturing very much. That's one thing. The other is that for the non-Annex 1 country cities, the national average for energy use is relatively low. So if you're in Zambia or Zimbabwe, even South Africa, the national average energy use is very low. So cities are where you have the concentration of energy use and concentration of manufacturing. I put up this slide just as an example for why we need to go beyond a single case study of a city to understand sustainability, that we really need to understand a typology, a larger portfolio of the types of cities that are out there. The other, I think, key result from the IPCC chapter that's relevant for this discussion is what's going to happen going forward in terms of these cities that haven't been built. And studies have shown that if, this is from a study that was published a couple of years ago but there are a couple of studies that have, or a number of studies that have basically corroborated this, is that if cities going into the future in non-Annex 1 countries, if they develop their infrastructure to the same level as Annex 1 countries, what's going to happen is, here's the Annex 1 average now, here's the global average. And what you see is that it's going to completely take away the degrees of freedom in terms of the emission savings. So clearly, one of the messages from this is that we cannot build cities of the 21st century with 19th century technology and ideas. We really need to rethink how we're going to build these cities. I just added these slides as a some data from remote sensing. Crystal and I were talking during lunch. She said, "You're not going to show any data from satellite data." So, these are data that from Steve Frockling's group up at University of New Hampshire. And just as a quick intro to image analysis here, what we see here on the y-axis is changes in a signal that can characterize the three-dimensional structure of cities. Okay. And what you see on this x-axis is change in a signal of the night lights, which I imagine many of you have seen. So one way to interpret this graph is when you see arrows moving in the horizontal direction, these are cities that are growing out. And arrows that are moving along the y-axis, these are cities that are building up. And so for Indian cities, we see that primarily Indian cities are building out with a little bit of vertical development in Delhi and Hyderabad, but primarily they're really building outward. We see the same with the African cities, a little bit more building up in places like Khartoum and Luanda. And if we move to the Chinese cities, we see really significant vertical development of infrastructure. And this just underscores my previous graph illustrating that there's so much new infrastructure that's being developed and more to come. We really need to rethink how we're doing this, the urgency of this sustainability science. So I'm going to end with this slide and say ultimately I am an optimist that there's going to be a science, an urbanization science that can help develop solutions, because there's more urban areas that's going to be developed. And this means that there's a tremendous window of opportunity to shape the cities that haven't been built. And so I'll end with that, and thank you for your attention.